Who was Kiliaen van Rensselaer? This enigmatic man founded one of the oldest European settlements in North America, yet here in the city and county that bear his name, he's still largely unknown today. I'm here in the city of Rensselaer, New York, and behind me is the capital, Albany. This entire area, some 800,000 acres, was once owned by the Dutchmen in the 17th century under the name of Rensselaerswijk. Come join me as I delve into this true American story of the man who made such a lasting impact on New York State. Kiliaen van Rensselaer was born in the year 1586, a turbulent time for his Dutch homeland. This was the height of the 80 Years' War, otherwise known as the Dutch War of Independence, against the Spanish Habsburgs.
Kiliaen was born at a time that the country, the Dutch Republic, it was a republic by then, it was at war. And if you know that the Dutch Republic consisted of different provinces, and these provinces were all very different from each other. So that they united was like into a republic without a king. That was something, only Venice was a republic, but nothing, there was no republic in the world that they knew at that time. So that was a very odd time in some ways in which he was born.
Kiliaen was born in his mother's hometown of Hasselt in the province of Overijssel.
It was a trading town, but because of the war, that town had been blockaded, so there was no trade anymore. So it was pretty much a dead town. There was no future for a kid his age, except for they were well-to-do, but there was not really a future for him. His father had been in the army under Prince Maurits.
Kiliaen's mother died while giving birth to his sister when he was still a small child, and his father was often away from home due to his career as a soldier.
His father died in a battle in Ostend in, I think it was 1603 or so, and he left a will that he and his little sister should be left in the care of his family, not in the care of Kiliaen's mother's family. So they were moved to the western part of the Dutch Republic. It meant that his sister ended up in Niekerk, where you have been, and Kiliaen ended up in Amsterdam with relatives. And that's where he started learning the trade and so forth.
Kiliaen went to Amsterdam to apprentice as a jeweler when he was about 16 years old. He would prove quite successful in this trade before moving on to a more global enterprise. This was on the cusp of the Dutch Golden Age, where artists like Rembrandt and Vermeer were painting their masterpieces, and Amsterdam was the financial capital of the world. This was also an age of great imperial competition, and world powers like Britain, France, Spain, and Portugal were rivals of the Dutch for colonies and trade routes. I traveled to the Netherlands to find out more about Kiliaen, starting with his father's hometown of Niekerk. Okay, so I am here in Niekerk, Netherlands. We're here at the Rensselaer farm, and I have a gentleman here who is the town historian for the town of Niekerk, and he's going to tell us a little bit about it. How you doing today, sir?
Yes.
What is your name?
My name is Jan Kozijnsen.
Very nice to meet you.
Yes.
Thank you for coming out with me today.
Yeah.
So, can you just tell us what we're looking at here?
This is the Rensselaer boerderij, so as we call it, the Rensselaer farm. And here, this is the origin of Kiliaen van Rensselaer. Yeah.
So did Kiliaen van Rensselaer himself live here?
He has been here, but he is not born here.
Okay.
He
was from Hasselt. He was born in Hasselt,
he was born
correct?
in Hasselt, yes.
And I know he had relatives, I believe, on his father's side. Were from Niekerk.
Yeah. And there is a family grave here in the very big stone, here in the big church of Niekerk.
So he probably visited here, but he did not live here.
No.
Okay.
He lived after his heritage of the diamond trade in Amsterdam. He went, of course, to Amsterdam to be a member of the West Indian Company.
Yes, of course, and that's the West India Company was set to colonize the New World, and he was a director, and he was a big part of that, and of course came to what is now known as New York and started Rensselaerswijk, the Patroonship there. So he had a very big impact on the state of New York.
But he has never been there, huh?
No,
His
he
sons have
no
been
he
there,
never
but
he never actually set foot
Yeah.
in New York, but he sent his nephew Arent
two
van
nephews,
Curler.
And Van Twiller, I think also.
Yeah,
was a nephew.
Twiller Van
Yeah.
Curler, who was
Yeah.
his nephew, who founded the city of Schenectady.
That's right.
And
That's our sister city since 2013.
yes,
Yes.
and yeah, I forgot about that. So yes,
Yeah.
Niekerk is the sister city of Schenectady, New York,
Yes.
which a lot of people don't know. So yeah, there's a big connection between this town specifically in the Netherlands with America, especially New York, the colony of New Netherland as it was once called.
See, his father was already in the army fighting the Spanish, so he would be a big supporter of Maurits, the stadtholder, who was the military guy. And Maurits, and of course more other people, had the idea, we have to get this war away from this country because it's destroying our country. We should try to bring it to South America because that's where the Spanish, they have, and the Portuguese, they were together at the time, where they have the big sugar mills, where they get sugar, and where they get their gold to finance this war. So if we can get our hands on Brazil, where they have these sugar mills, and if we can get the people where the gold mines are, in Peru and near Chile there, then we can beat the Spaniards. If we make sure that they don't get that gold anymore from those mines, the gold and silver especially, so then we may be able to beat the Spaniards. So what they try to do is bring that war to South America. And in 1602, that was right at the time that Kiliaen came in Amsterdam, they had just founded the East India Company. That was a company for trade, but it could also bring armies over.
In 1609, the Dutch and Spanish agreed to a 12-year truce, during which time the Dutch made their first contact with North America. Upon completion of the truce in 1621, the Dutch West India Company was formed to pursue the colonization of the New World.
They had the truce in 1609, right the same year when Henry Hudson sailed up here. That was also right the time that Kiliaen may have been done a little bit with learning how to become a jeweler and a merchant. So that was a golden time for him to start working with these relatives who were really well-to-do. And right at the end of 1621, or the truce, the West India Company was established, and the first thing they did was send ships out to Brazil to take that on the Spanish. And think that West India Company, well, it's good for investing. I mean, it's a trading company, right? And people could buy shares. So he got all his relatives or a lot of friends to invest in this company, like that could be done in the East India Company too. So he got a lot of people to buy shares. He invested a lot in it himself, and he invested enough to become a director of that company. But the West India Company, even more so than the East India maybe, was a war company. It was a trading company, but it was also war. They were going to kind of end this war with Spain by beating it in Brazil and trying to get those gold mines, and you needed armies for that. I think he had enough money to invest to become a director, and you had to, I forget how much you had to invest, but he was able to cough up that money. And I'm sure that, well, his father and his uncle, they left him a certain amount of money, so he had already something. And then with the jewelry business, they did very well. I mean, he always had that on the side still, or, I mean, Rensselaer's work, he may have been really busy with, but he still had the jewelry business too, and that was a major operation too. That was a big business. He had representatives in Russia and in France and so forth.
So this is the West Indisch House. Translation is the West India House. This was the headquarters of the Dutch West India Company, of which Kiliaen van Rensselaer was one of the directors. You see here, it's a very old, beautiful building. This is the side entrance The front entrance is up there. It's undergoing renovations right now, so I can't really get a good view of it. So the building's now an event hall, like an event venue. Looks like there's some kind of wedding going on right now. Looks like a very nice place. So this building was built in 1617. Okay. It was taken over by the Dutch West India Company around 1623, which had just been newly formed. Okay, and they were here on and off till about 1792. Well, actually, that's 1792 is basically how long the company lasted. They only stayed here a short time, and then they moved to other buildings. But this was the original headquarters for the company. So Kiliaen van Rensselaer was one of the directors, and he would have definitely met here with the other directors to discuss the ongoing colonization of the New World. Aside from the war against the Spanish, there was much money to be made in the New World. In North America, the most lucrative commodity was beaver fur. And while some strictly wanted to exploit New Netherland for commercial gain, others saw the benefit of full-scale colonization.
Kiliaen was really a supporter of populating the area, and he's always tried that. And then in 1629, right after they had conquered one silver fleet, the only one silver fleet that they were really able to conquer, they pushed with this idea that they had already going, of course, for a while, of patroonships. That meant one person could buy a piece of land of a certain dimension and along a river and so forth, and he needed to send there for, I think in the first 4 years there should be 50 people there or something, and then he could govern this patroonship from the Netherlands, and he could send agents and form a government, like a local government, in his patroonship. There were a few other people who did that too. There were Kiliaen then knew about this area, and he knew it because he had all kinds of connections, and kind of a relative of him knew already about this area in about 1610. The man was a director of the East India Company, for which Hudson sailed. So he had his connections. He knew that this land was very fertile.
There were several other patroon ships throughout the Hudson Valley in modern-day New Jersey and Delaware. All of them except Rensselaer's Vike failed due to mismanagement and/or violent conflict with the natives.
But Kiliaen said, I want 6,000 guilders because I have already invested quite a bit and I've sent people out here. I'm not going to sell it for less, and the company did not want to pay him that. So then he stuck with it and kept sending more people. And so that's how he kind of remained the only person really to survive.
Right. This is the farm of Arent van Slichtenhorst.
Okay.
And this is the farm from 1696. And Arent van Slichtenhorst was the historical writer of the Veluwe here in Holland. He studied in Leiden together with Hugo de Groot. And Alexander van der Donck, you know him? Was
Adrian van der Donck?
Van der Donck, yes.
Yeah, he was one of the original explorers of New Netherland.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And he has known him.
Yes.
And he was a pupil of Hugo de Groot, with whom he studied.
Okay.
And he was one of the founders of the first laws in Manhattan, in New Amsterdam. But that was Arent van Slichtenhorst. But Brand van Slichtenhorst, his son, has gone to America, also on demand of Kiliaen van Rensselaer, of course, and he was one of the founders of Beverwijk.
The village that became Albany eventually.
Albany,
yes. Yeah. Okay, so there's another connection to Rensselaer Vike, to Albany, to current day New York State.
Yes.
So a lot of the founders, early settlers of America, this is before there was such thing as America, obviously, but especially New York State, the Northeast New York, a lot of Dutch history and heritage, and a lot of them came from this area. A lot of them have connections to this specific area in the Netherlands, which is very interesting.
Not only the Dutch, after 50 years, when the Englishmen took over, there were already 30 cultures in New York. It was a melting pot of cultures.
Yes.
In comparison to Boston, for example, there was only the Pilgrim Fathers and no other ones.
Yes.
And it's a bit the same as in Holland. In the first 17th century, that in Holland there was many fugitives from Europe. In Holland, you could think what you want, you could say what you want, and it's still the same. And it was even already in that time. And those people went to New York, and there was the same culture as in Holland.
Yes.
Many peoples were welcome. Many cultures were welcome.
Yes, and a lot of people say that the current culture in New York, even all this time, 400 years later, is based in part from that Dutch culture that started in New Amsterdam, which is why New York, even to this day, is a little bit different from, say, Virginia or the Deep South that was strictly British culture. They were a little more tough, a little more uptight, So I think it's true that even today in New York is a little bit different and is a little more open, and that's partly because of the Dutch.
I think that it's a little bit the Dutch, of course.
Yeah, of course.
But the other Americans themselves who have maintained those cultures.
Yes. Okay, so now we're at the house of Arent van Curler, who was the founder of Schenectady.
Yes.
Do you want to tell us a little bit about this place? And
Arent van Curler was the nephew of Kiliaen van Rensselaer, and he told him, go to America and colonize your country. But he founded a city of his own. But this is the farm.
So he was born here?
He's born here, and the farm is of course a lot different than it was in those days, but this is the place where he is born. So, the whole area is called Curler. Curlerwijk,
Curlerwijk, like Rensselaerwijk.
Yeah.
And Wijk just means like a district, something like that.
Yeah, big district of the city.
Yeah. Yes, okay. So Curler, and then in America they changed it to Curler. Right?
Yeah,
they just changed the sound, the spelling.
In the early days we say Curler. That is just different in time. What you use.
This is a long tradition in America. A lot of people, they come from a different country and they change their name a little bit to make, because of pronunciation.
That was the main reason, I think.
Yeah. It's hard for me, it's hard to pronounce a lot of Dutch words, so it makes sense.
Yeah, just like the Schlichtenhorst.
Schlichtenhorst, yeah. Okay, so I'm here at 277 Keizersgracht in downtown Amsterdam. Okay, this was the home of Kiliaen van Rensselaer in the 17th century. This house was built around 1620, and he lived until his death in 1643. Okay, the name of the house was Het Gekruiste Hart, which means the crossed heart. So obviously that has religious symbolism. Kiliaen was a very religious man, and he was very active in the church, the Dutch Reformed Church. And he would have sang a lot of religious songs here with his family. Music, from what we know, music was very important to him and his family, so him and his wife and children would have sat around here, sang songs. He was a collector of artwork, so there would have been some nice, expensive pieces of art in here. He had a home office, so this is where he would have sat and wrote letters to his agents, his subordinates in the colony of New Netherland. You can imagine him sitting at his desk, perhaps looking out at the canal right here in front of me, writing to the people, asking for information about what's going on in the new colony. He was very interested in what was going on in the colony. He was a very meticulous man. He was trained as an accountant and a businessman, a jeweler, so he kept very tight records of everything. So he lived here up until his death in 1643, when he was buried in the Oude Kerk, which we'll go to next. Okay, so I'm here at the Oude Kerk in downtown Amsterdam, and this is the grave site of Kiliaen van Rensselaer. Okay, let's go inside, check it out. Okay, so we're now inside the Oude Kerk, which means old church, and this is one of the oldest buildings in Amsterdam. Okay, this was originally built in the 13th century. Okay, it was originally a Catholic church, and then after the Reformation, it was converted into a Protestant church. So they took out all the icons, pictures, whatnot. converted it into a Protestant church. Okay, and here we have the grave marker for Kiliaen van Rensselaer. He's buried here on church grounds. You see, he passed away in October 1643. And he's one of the many people buried here. Also, Adrian Block is buried here also. He was one of the early explorers of New Netherland. Actually, Block Island off the coast of Rhode Island is named after him. He's also buried here. I asked Dr. Venema for some final thoughts about Kiliaen van Rensselaer the man. What was he like and what drove him?
He has been portrayed as a greedy, grumpy man, a greedy, grumpy old man, and I don't agree with that at all. I mean, he was a jeweler. How do you think when you're a jeweler? You deal with very little measurements. You work with the tiniest detail. So, and then you take this big undertaking and you bring people over and you're responsible for them that they do well. I mean, for his business, but also for, I mean, he is a Christian and he has to care for his people too. I see him as very broad, and maybe a merchant is narrow, I don't know, but on the same hand, to do all this stuff, he must know about so many things and be excited about doing all of it too. To dare, and he dared to do it. Right? So people forget about it, and they portray him sometimes as this greedy guy who is writing about these little details about where the church has to stand and that they don't write him enough and so forth and so forth. But if you kind of realize like how new this stuff was. I mean, this is a continent, it's a new continent, and to settle people over there, I mean, it's like sending people to the moon or so maybe, and he was somebody who undertook that kind of stuff. He was an entrepreneur, he dared to do this, but in the same time, he had his own money invested, but people at the time always worked together with other people, because otherwise you could not finance it, not just yourself. And so he had this whole network of people that he had to bear responsibility for. So he could not just say, well, I've had enough, I stop. No, he had taken them along with it.
The colony of New Netherland was officially surrendered to the British in 1664, some 20 years after Kiliaen's death. Even under the new rulers, the Dutch retained a major cultural presence for centuries to come. The Rensselaers maintained much of their estate until the 1840s, when it was finally broken up upon the death of Stephen van Rensselaer, otherwise known as the last patroon.
You know, he died before England was ever an enemy, because Spain has always been the enemy, and his whole life was at war with Spain, and only the truce in between those 12 years, but for the rest his entire life was a period of war with Spain, and England would be at that time a safe place. Wolfert van Bijler, who he lived with for, you know, and learned his trade, lived in England for like a whole number of years. His sons later came to Albany, or to Beverwijk then, and Rensselaerswijk, of course. And Jeremias becomes then the director of the Patroonship at some point, and he says, you know, that they have to learn English, and nobody knows how to read and speak English yet, because they had not expected that. They would even have expected that it would be given back to the Dutch eventually. So that is the only thing you could say about that. But I would think he would have taken it pretty hard.